The UFC has broken ground on the White House lawn ahead of the staging of its June 14th event, with coverage mounting as we are less than 2 weeks away. And for many people, the question is, how did this happen? And the perfect person to answer that question for us, he is joining us here on Post Wrestling, the author of the new book, Ultimate Fighters, Donald Trump, Dana White, and UFC's Road to the White House. He is Lavie Margolin. Lavie, welcome to the show. It's great to chat with you, and congratulations on your latest book release.
Great to be here. Thank you so much. I just booked my Amtrak ticket and hotel room for the Ellipse on June 14th.
You will be attending this.
Yes, I actually have a semi-inside connection to the White House, but they tried. But thus far, no ticket on the White House lawn. But I figured I have to go to the Ellipse, even though it'll be 93 degrees.
How are you approaching this event? Like, what does this event mean in the grand scope of things for the UFC? And I imagine we can already see there's going to be unprecedented coverage for this, but give me like a macro view of what this event represents.
Yeah, it's massive for them. A lot of people, in our bubble, of course, everyone knows the UFC and its story and its players and its history. But for most of the general population, it's still a mystery. Not as many people as we think like to follow MMA, and the story as it crosses their purview is quite fascinating to them, and it's almost shocking. I myself was even shocked on July 4th when it was announced at the Iowa State Fair, and from the reaction of the people behind Trump as well, they seemed to think it was a joke. So this is putting the UFC on the radar of many. I'm not sure it pushes it closer to the mainstream. It's just more of a surprise as to how this is happening and why this is happening.
Yeah, it seems like this is like a familiar strategy you will see, where it is something that to the general public is just seen as like it's like a shocking type of event that is being done, but they're going through with it. And it is one that, I mean, like I'm very curious for like the UFC side. Like, obviously they see a long-term value in this enough that it is one that they are willing to take this one-day loss with the idea that it is going to be a level of exposure, a level of connection to people that have probably never laid eyes on a UFC fight in their history. And like, this truly is, and this segues very well into the book. Like, it's the culmination of something that has been years and years in the making, and this has kind of coalesced into like the ultimate fever dream of this marriage, where you are placing an octagon onto the South Lawn. And for one day, the UFC is going to be top of mind for a lot of people in the country.
Yeah, it's the culmination of this relationship, especially between Donald Trump and Dana White. And as Dana White talks about, loyalty. And for the most part, that's played out. But, if you look at, some of the fighters that helped to usher him into the UFC, Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell, where are they now? And for Donald Trump as well, it's sort of loyalty as long as it's convenient. But I think there really is some sort of friendship there, and it's really beneficial to both people, as we've seen in both, for politics and the UFC as a company. Trump really getting back into the fold of the semi-mainstream with the UFC's ushering of him, into events. And for the UFC, it lends so much visibility and credibility to be endorsed by the president.
So I want to know from your vantage point, Lavie, and I can only imagine this is going to increase in the days to come as we are under 2 weeks away from this event, is that you are seeing a lot of non-MMA, non-sports media that is now hyper-focused on this event, and a lot of it is writing about the history. And I don't say this lightly. I think a lot of people should be reading this book for the proper context, because I imagine that you are reading a lot of this stuff, and we are seeing sort of a mythology that has been created about the impact of Donald Trump, and a lot of people focusing on like almost this dire situation and Donald Trump giving them a life raft in 2001, and you detail this really well, like the reality separating from the fiction of this history, which, I mean, outside of those events, like it is not like Donald Trump was this avid MMA consumer during the 2000s and really before he entered the political arena.
Yeah, there's just so much that's was previously lost to time or just forgotten about. There used to be the phrase the Zuffa myth, but since Zuffa sold, of course, and what is now TKO, that stopped. But of course, UFC 28 was the first UFC to take place at Trump's casino, and that was certainly under SEG, where they worked out a deal to return twice more UFC 30 and 31, which then became under Zuffa's ownership and Dana White's purview. And as Dana White says, Trump was there from the prelims to the main event and fully supported. Of course, he wasn't there. You can't see him on screen. The backstage interviewer Wormy confirmed that recently on X as well. But it could be, let's say, giving Dana White a little bit of room here. It could be sort of a reimagining it or misremembering, because in what seemed to be another step towards legitimacy, UFC 32 at the Continental Airlines Arena, Trump was there. I'm not sure if it was the first prelim, but he was shown on screen with Melania Nows at the time, as they were not yet married, and he fully supported, the show from that perspective.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that he does have an affinity now for MMA, but I think it's also one that, like, you can go through layers. Like there is a certain symbol when you now see a Donald Trump or members of his administration attending a card. Like, it is a bit of a status symbol. It is a bit of aligning yourself with this brand. And it's a brand that has also been very open to welcoming that affiliation and almost turning the UFC specifically, rather than the greater sport of it is an attachment to this administration, but it also symbolizes something now to the public of what this means. And they are very close in alignment to the same messaging that you are getting from the Trump party as well. They are in lockstep with one another, and it has been beneficial to both. This is not some one-sided relationship.
Yeah, it's sort of like you don't have to be a MAGA fan to be a UFC fan, but if you are MAGA affiliated, it's the most friendly sports environment for that. Sometimes it could feel a little bit underground. Sometimes it's Sean Strickland, that's winning a main event, and it's sort of like, what am I watching exactly? But Donald Trump gets highlighted, and especially you could look at it throughout post January 6th. Every time he's come, there's been trouble for him, whether he's dealing with an indictment when he's not the president, or a difficult war scenario or economy. So here he can go and receive praise and adulation from UFC fans, from the announcers, from Joe Rogan. And it's interesting how Joe Rogan on his podcast, and he has a long history of this. Sometimes he's very critical of Trump. Sometimes he praises him. But certainly on the UFC broadcast, and then shortly following it, he's praising him. And sometimes when we think there's even difficulty, they're actually chatting, and then they share that they fast-tracked some sort of medical treatment, which sounds a little bit scary, but that gives them the opportunity to connect and do that.
It is. And yeah, I think you detailed this really well. And that's where, I mean, I'm not going to reduce this relationship about Dana White and Donald Trump to a transactional one. I think there's a genuine respect and friendship that these two have cultivated. And to what you mentioned earlier, like, the number one trait for you to stay in that orbit with Donald Trump is loyalty. And Dana White has shown that tenfold in this. Like, you are never going to hear this man run afoul. Like, Joe Rogan has done more to speak against Trump that you are just never going to hear from a Donald Trump, or sorry, from a Dana White. But it is also like the timing of these, and post January 6th, this guy was radioactive on the world stage. And outside of that one speech at CPAC, like it's the UFC who were arms open to embrace Donald Trump. And this was his safe haven that he could come to a UFC event, and that was a powerful image, and they understood that. Here is the UFC that understands the value of like the audience seeing who is really presented as a celebrity to them and getting a celebrity like reaction, an entrance that is custom made for him. And those were powerful visuals. And I think Donald Trump knows exactly like the power of the medium. And I don't think it's any different. Like here we see like where Trump's polling numbers are right now. There's a lot of unpopularity heading into the midterms. And you're going to get this one day where Donald Trump is going to be presented as like the kingmaker on this broadcast and that is going to be broadcast across the country.
Yeah, when we often see Trump's tweets, like where he goes in depth about UFC interest and even crossing over into wrestling, and sort of like how closely is he following this? So I think at least partly that's Stephen Chung, who
A figure I definitely want to talk about. Yeah, because he was a really interesting figure that I don't know how many people really understand who Stephen Chung is.
Yeah, one of those puzzle pieces, and we can get into it in a minute. But the UFC has also been helpful to Trump, not only from a January 6th return, but even during the coronavirus.
Sure.
There was a push for sports leagues to get back. We have to get back, as Trump kept pushing, and they were willing to do it. And for the most part, it worked out fine, and their business grew by multiples from there. And then the sports leagues were willing to do it. So in the same way, in terms of media, okay, somebody has to do this first. Once they do it, then we're willing to take the leap as well.
At what point, like Lavie, obviously you have been following this like super closely. Like there was a time, and it seems ridiculous now to look back at a UFC in its growth period where I mean they had the fighter code of conduct. There were firings over rape jokes on Twitter. There was like Dana White stating like to a Yoel Romero, like no one wants to hear you speaking about God when they're like it was a completely different characteristic that you were seeing of a Dana White and of the image of the UFC. Is it as easy as saying that shift followed the shift of the country in 2015, 2016? Where did you see that change to now where the UFC, you can do anything you want, and Dana White has really ingrained himself as a champion of that type of what delves into hate speech, for instance?
I think it was never a pure play. Dana White has always had, problems like containing himself as somebody that claims to be a Southie, but basically has four hometowns, depending on how you define it. Right. One of the first breakout diatribes was his rant against Loretta Hunt.
Mm-hmm. This was around 2009.
Yeah, where he used the other F word, one that I wasn't comfortable putting in the book. You couldn't avoid the first F word just because it's so popular. So that, that sort of impact led to the PR teams kind of reaching out to LGBTQ affiliated organizations and saying, like, how can we help you? And we are all fighters and that sort of stuff. So it wasn't so much of the company like having this core of like, okay, we want to help people, and or this is in the mainstream right now politically, in terms of supporting that. So it wasn't always as pure as that, but they have followed the political headwinds, especially presidential political headwinds, in terms of how are we going to point ourselves as well. But even in the last days of Zuffa, they did highlight gay identifying fighters, whereas I think what is now TKO is sort of more bottom line focused and kind of calculating like what can we make the most money from, and what's the way to portray ourselves, or in an annoying Paramount ad that plays over and over again with the Ram trucks. In loud we trust. And I'm just wondering how that plays to people that don't even know who Dana White is, and be like, what is this?
Yeah, and it kind of all crystallizes. We keep going back to this White House event that it is also sort of like this culmination of Dana White. Like when you see, like, this is not any of these places that I think could even potentially identify Ilya Taporia out of a lineup. Like, it is Dana White that is on the cover of Time magazine. It is Dana White that is doing all of this big media. And, and that's been a consistent focus of the UFC, is that ultimately, like, Dana White is the first symbol you associate with the UFC, and this is sort of the apex of that.
Yeah, it's in a way it's smart, and going back to the wrestling roots, right? Like the booker, the owner would put themselves on top of the territory because you know that they'll be around. So since the Ultimate Fighter reality show, I don't know if it just happenstance or is strategic. Dana White, especially "Do you want to be a fighter" speech, he came across as the star and sort of the overlord, and the kingmaker there, and that's really carried through. And as long as he sort of blesses it, then it gets attention. And I think it can be off-putting. And for me, um, you know, following the Attitude Era in wrestling, that was sort of when I transitioned to become like a huge MMA fan. And once the first generation of stars was sort of, or second generation was transitioning out, I kind of lost a little bit of interest. A, because the people I followed were starting to lose more, and B, like the Dana White thing was just becoming like overwhelming and kind of annoying, and I just kind of shifted my focus elsewhere. Obviously, the gains were more than the negatives, but I think it has been off-putting to some people at times.
Since you also have written the Trump Mania book, you're probably the person best equipped to answer this. If you were to put Donald Trump in the White House, like in a different era, when sort like attitude era, do you think like a Vince McMahon could have cultivated a relationship like this with a Donald Trump? Is this specific to like a Dana White that just there's been this interesting power vacuum that has encompassed his relationship with Donald Trump? You have Joe Rogan that's certainly part of that equation. Like where is like I'm essentially asking like the differences of a Vince McMahon and a Dana White, both of whom had very close relationships with Donald Trump over the years.
I always felt with Vince McMahon and Donald Trump, it was more transactional.
Mm-hmm.
And they seem more similar than they are, different in terms of similar places in life and um, leadership and that sort of thing, even though they come from fairly different backgrounds. But with Dana White, with playing amateur psychologist, right? Like, you don't have to look too far to kind of try to understand that relationship from a more personal level. I know Dana White employed his father for a bit with Zuffa, but obviously there were some issues there in the home. His mom wrote a book kind of
Mm-hmm.
how bad he is as a person, which is kind of sad, no matter what you think about Dana White. So Dana White's around 25 years younger than Donald Trump, and he's seeking his attention and affection. So it's kind of like a father figure type of relationship. And Dana White always talks about like, I
It's
want
also very similar to Donald Trump and his own father. Like that was the guy's hero, was his father. And you look at the relationships of parents to children in those instances, no different from Vince Jr. with Vince Sr., I think.
yeah, and there's issues there, but like Dana White wants him to be, his friend, and they bro out together and so on. So I think it is, a deeper relationship there,
Mm-hmm.
and I think for Vince McMahon, he would certainly look at it to say, access and credibility, and I think that's what Donald Trump brought a lot to WWE in the mainstream. It was a name with The Apprentice and sort of like lend that credibility and attention to things.
So we mentioned the name Stephen Chung. He is the someone that is right at the side of Donald Trump as the White House communications director. But what is his attachment in a prior life to the UFC and what is the role he has played over the years? Because he becomes a really interesting supporting character in your book that I imagine is one of the lesser known figures, but someone that does carry a lot of influence.
Yeah, he's fascinating. He's like one of those like connectors that once he comes across your purview, you're like, oh, this is how it's all working. So just a little bit of his background. He grew up an ECW fan, watching it late night in Sacramento. His family wasn't very politically involved, but he would read the paper. Apparently he wasn't very athletic, but he was on the football team and he trained in Muay Thai and those sort of things. And he got into the UFC. He got after some political jobs, some political volunteerism, as many people do who try to get into that field after not graduating college. He worked with the UFC and he supported their communications, especially as they try to make inroads in places like New York and California. And when he applied for to Trump during the first campaign, they were like really impressed. They're like, "Oh, the UFC pedigree." A term that comes up a lot is a killer. He's a killer, and all the things he learned from Dana White. And he was kind of on the periphery, but he kept ingratiating himself more and more. Some people call him odd job, which is something that he embraced. He has actually, no matter what you think, he sort of like has a funny personality where he's not afraid of these things. Where Trump said, "Look at those hands. I know, I know, I'm safe here." So really, where he put himself in the circle of trust, where to borrow a phrase from Meet the Parents, was that in 2023 when Trump was facing indictment. He's like, don't worry, your ratings will actually improve. They'll get better. And they did. And sort of like that's when he became like, a consigliere or whatever to Trump, where Trump would often say, ask Stephen, even though he didn't used to remember his name so well. And Chung is like, he's really good at the put downs and so on. Like with Biden, change your diaper or, whatever, like, she's a dumb bird, the sort of stuff that's like surface level, but it carries well. Yeah, that's where he is. So, but he's obviously a huge UFC fan, huge wrestling fan, and kind of the connector as we see these things. He even conferred the Ola Olafalu. I'm messing that up,
Uh-huh.
where. Yeah, on Trump. Like there's a picture on that. So he's the head of the table, the head of the family.
It's just a surreal picture that we have of this current administration and the influences that they wield. But I mean, he's also somebody that in your book he gets a lot of credit for, and Dana White too, about the impact of the podcast like renaissance that we saw during this last 2024 election, and nothing bigger that became a talking point than Trump going on the Joe Rogan Experience for 3 hours, and Dana White, who is not political, apolitical Dana White, who basically orchestrated that appearance, worked on Rogan for months to get him on, and then really pushed Rogan to give him that final endorsement at the end of October, just 10 days before the election as well. And that's, Rogan is another interesting component to this interesting power vacuum that the UFC had access to. And it's just all these elements that sort of coalesced in 2024. And the end result is reelecting Donald Trump, which seemed completely impossible in 2021 after January 6th. And there on the dais with him is Dana White the night that he is reelected. Like it's just it's a scene you could just not envision at all, of if you are somebody that had been a longtime UFC fan and seeing how big of a play they were able to be a part of.
Yeah, that scene where he thanked, the various podcasters that really like brought it home. There was you're always looking for advantages, of course, in politics, and there's always a million different cuts, especially during a presidential election. But one of the things was the disaffected, white male voter who, maybe wouldn't even vote. And, you know, uh, different mainstream media outlets were just like, well, they're not going to get out of their parents' basement to go and vote. Kind of like what wrestlers sometimes say about fans that are critical of them. That same comparison, but if you hit them with the right messaging, they'll go. And that was sort of one of the differences in the swing states, getting into these different podcasts, not only Joe Rogan, but things like Bussin' with the Boys. That was actually some of the most painful part of research for the books. Joe Rogan's wasn't bad, but having to listen to the other stuff. But don't worry, I distilled it in the book in a way that
You're a martyr, Lavie, for having to endure all those podcast sit downs.
Yeah, that was painful.
Now, when we look at, I guess, the poll you cite was this Harris poll that Politico worked on in 2023, and it revealed a really interesting split of UFC fans that lean like 55% Republican, and the fact that your thought even 3 years ago that it would be a wider split. And I guess the question is, like, UFC has made a very calculated decision to go all in and open up its broadcast for the red carpet is there for Donald Trump and for this administration. And there's obviously going to be fans that are turned off by this. Have you looked at it like, obviously you can look at the results. This has led to the UFC having like no impact negatively on business at all. But do you think like there is some risk here of like, what is the untold fan base that has been repelled by this? And is it one that changes at all the dynamic of the UFC in a post-Trump administration?
I think some people are put off by it, but ultimately, like we've seen with things like Disney or sports ownership affiliations, people are going to ultimately choose what's best for them and what they enjoy most. So they can complain about it and even write something about it, share it on social media. But at the end of the day, if they enjoy MMA, then they're going to continue watching, as long as you don't push it over the cliff. I think
they go pretty hard. Like,
yeah, yeah.
and
I think
June 14th is going to be. I think like that's one where like what you're getting into when you're sitting down to watch this event. Like, this is what it is, and like there's definitely, I think, an audience that is like, they're there for the fights. And it's just so interesting because this was not going back 15 years ago with Dana White. This was like going back to the pandemic. Like, you're never going to hear the pandemic talked about on our airwaves. It's an escape for people. No one wants to hear about this real world stuff until it was beneficial for them. And now it's like, there is like tons of political messaging that is now injected. So, I mean, it's hard to navigate, but it's one that like I don't know if the UFC deems like again, it's a calculated risk, and it's one that has won them over so far, and been to their benefit.
Yeah, and it's interesting, even under the TKO umbrella, how both, actually, at least the brands that we follow, I don't know what. Well, actually, I do have a sense of what PBR is up to, but in terms of the WWE UFC comparison, WWE, stays away from it, just sort of a little bit vanilla in that way, whereas the UFC embraces it more, and that is, probably a better understanding of your audience. Certainly, and Campbell McLaren, I was talking about it in my class, and then tweeted about it to some controversy that conservatives are more MMA fans, which again, I think the polling has showed that it's not so clear cut. It draws a number of people, but at its base, there is a stronger element to that, and you can sort of like work from that and build from it, and you don't have to be as afraid of it as something that is maybe more mainstream.
So post June 14th, what do you see changing at all in terms of this this marriage between the UFC with the Trump administration, and like, do you imagine like Dana White being sort of a player in the run up to the 2028 election? Do you think that June 14th represents sort of like the climax of this last decade between these two? Because it's always been like, I think Dana White, for as much as you want to scoff at like being apolitical, like his loyalty has been to Donald Trump, and I think much less so the Republican cause.
Yeah, I think this is the penultimate showcase of the relationship, but I think it'll continue on, as it has been, where when it's advantageous to Trump to come to the UFC with Kid Rock, or as he calls him, Bob, and other politicians, to attend the shows. I think one of the things that could shake it up, and I have no evidence of this, it'll just come out if it's applicable. Was the funding as clear cut, as it's demonstrated to
Mm,
be? What will the White House lawn actually look like afterwards? If there's some controversy as people dig into these numbers and do their freedom of information requests, and if it's starting to look bad on Trump, he'll kind of take a step further away from the, oh, okay, that was the UFC, that wasn't me. So a lot of unknowns right now, but if there is something like that, that is something that could happen.
yeah, we will see if there's any no bid contracts or any hidden fees that go into this particular event. Before we wrap up, I would be remiss not to ask you that we are less than a week away, where this WWE shareholder lawsuit is scheduled to begin on Monday in the Delaware Chancery Court. What is your prognostication of this trial actually starting on Monday, or the potential of a settlement? Because this case has uncovered just loads of information about TKO, and how this company is run is really not that different from the UFC antitrust suit, where we learned so much about the DNA of this company.
Yeah, so Monday also gives the chance for the lawyers to actually all be there
Mm-hmm.
together and to
Yes.
talk. So it could wrap up quite quickly, as you've covered so well with Brandon week to week, and in articles as well on Post Wrestling. Once there's an assumption that certain text messages and signal messages and voicemails or whatever have been deleted, that really puts you in a bad position, where you'll have to assume that what was deleted was puts you in a negative light. So to start out with such a disadvantage, especially with a company that wants to keep things as quiet as possible, it's probably in their best interest to settle, although there is that inherent we have to win machismo. But if you see the odds are so stacked against you, that might be the better course to go.
Well, if we get 4 days of this trial, it's an all star lineup of people that are set to take the stand. I know you will be very very hyper focused on this trial, Lavie. I also want to ask, and we can promote the book here, which I really do encourage people. Like, if you enjoy like this kind of the discussion, like this really is kind of like a history of the UFC after Zuffa's purchase, and how much Dana White has been involved in various politics. Like, we didn't even get into it, like where he was like stumping for Harry Reid for a period. Like, for these companies, it's like you acquiesce to who is going to be a benefit to you, and these two sides, they have very much benefited each other in terms of Dana White and Donald Trump. So this White House card, it was announced last July. Did you start the book almost right after the announcement?
Yes, so I remember exactly where I was when I saw the announcement. I was in Dave and Buster's in Times Square,
Of course.
and a couple times a year, I allow my son, like, here's $200. We can't go to the arcade all the time, but have fun. So after a couple, I like video games too, but after a couple hours, I kind of like have to check out. So I was plugging in my phone, listening. I was like, oh my gosh, like, I've been thinking, I finished my doctoral degree. I've been thinking, like, what's my next book? And I had actually thought about it, this relationship a little bit in the past, but I was like, this is it, So that's when I really started, diving into it.
And it's amazing reading it, because like I'm going along. I'm like, man, he's still. We're into 2026 now, and then we're suddenly into like the planning stages, and then it's like the card announcement. I mean, like you like went right up until like the whole card was announced. Like you really just like went as far as you could up until this White House event, and it's like I said this on our book club review. Like the research is it's really like top level lobby that you did in this. Like there were so many details that just paint a picture of like what like so many little facts that maybe have fallen just been lost to time.
Yeah, thank you so much. That means so much, especially given your understanding of the sport and historical research. But what I did was I was waiting for that card announcement, so I wrote the whole book up to that point and even formatted it. And I remember where I was when the card came out. I was actually in the theater at Madison Square Garden. I was watching Muay Thai fights, and I was like, "Oh, here's the card." When home, obviously Sunday, I started writing that, and that week, I finished the book with an understanding that poo poo, it didn't happen, but if somebody gets injured and then they negotiate with a big name or some story, and there's been different stories that have happened afterwards, like where will people use the bathroom? But besides that, I think it tells the comprehensive story pre White House fights.
Well, you can pick it up now. Again, Ultimate Fighters, Donald Trump, Dana White, and UFC's road to the White House. And Lavie, we might have to extend the invite after the White House event. Now that we know that you're going to be there, because I do look forward to a live experience of going to the Ellipse. You can also catch Lavie's work on the Business of the Business podcast, and that's available on all podcast apps as well. It's a great show you do with John, and I really appreciate you, Lavie, for stopping by, chatting with us. You can also catch Trump Mania and see how the relationship of Donald Trump with Vince McMahon segueing into Donald Trump with Dana White. I mean, a kind of surreal triangle of political power that you probably could not have forecasted 15 years ago.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to join, and at the ready post White House card.